Yesterday at the Game Developers Conference, Valve held a developer talk about the Steam hardware and SteamOS. Most of the presentation was aimed at developers, but there were actually a few really interesting news about how future Steam devices will handle compatibility, and the two big things here are the Steam Machine Verified and Steam Frame Verified program. Let's start with the Steam Machine side. Valve showed a slide explaining how the Steam Machine verification system works, and it's actually very closely tied to the Steam Deck verification program. Basically, the Steam Deck test becomes the starting point, and if a game is deck verified, it automatically becomes machine verified. If a game is deck playable, because of things like UI scaling or default resolution, it can still become machine verified because those problems usually disappear on a bigger screen. But if a game is deck playable because of input issues, then it will stay machine playable instead. And if a game is unsupported on deck because of SteamOS compatibility, it will also be unsupported on Steam Machine. The only category that gets a second chance is games that were unsupported on Steam Deck because of performance. Those can be retested for Steam Machine hardware. So the whole system is basically built on top of the Steam Deck testing pipeline, which actually makes a lot of sense. But the part that's really caught everyone's attention is the performance requirement that Valve has outlined for the Steam Machine. For a game to be Steam Machine verified, the target is 1080p at 30 FPS. Now personally, I think this is where things get very interesting. Valve has said that these systems could be around 6 times more powerful than the Steam Deck, so naturally people are asking, if the hardware is that much stronger, why is the verification target only 30 FPS? In my opinion, this is probably just about maximizing compatibility and game catalog. Verification programs aren't meant to represent the best possible performance, they're meant to guarantee the minimum experience Valve is comfortable recommending. And up until the last 2 console generations, a lot of games usually ran at 30 FPS. And by setting the baseline at 30 FPS, Valve can immediately say that a huge portion of the Steam library works on Steam machines out of the go. But there is also some cause for concern. We are at the point where most TVs are either 60Hz or 120Hz, and this entire console generation marketed 60 FPS as a major feature. So seeing 30 FPS as the official baseline for a new living room device definitely feels a little strange, and it may turn people off, especially since they're also not trying to compete with consoles in terms of price. Personally, I think most games will probably run at 60 FPS or more on the Steam Machine. The 30 FPS number is just the minimum guarantee. But it's still an interesting signal about how Valve is thinking about performance targets. The other major part of the presentation was the Steam Frame. Valve has so far outlined 2 different ways it will work. The first is streaming mode, and in this mode your PC runs the game and the headset simply streams it. And in that scenario, Valve says there is no verification program required. Basically, if the game runs well on your PC, it should work fine on the Steam Frame. But there's also the standalone mode where the device runs games locally. For that, Valve is introducing Steam Frame Standalone Verified program. And the requirements here are a bit different. Standalone VR games need to run at 90 FPS, which is pretty standard for VR, and standard 2D games need to run at 720p and 30 FPS. Again, that's clearly meant to be a minimum baseline rather than the ideal experience. However, it gives a big insight into what we can expect from SteamOS on ARM devices. After having tested more than 150 PC games on my AYN Odin, which is running an ARM Snapdragon 8 Elite chip, I would say 720p at 30 FPS is what most games will be running at. There are some indie titles that can run at 60 FPS, but unfortunately the technology is just not there yet to demand more performance. So the upcoming ARM version of SteamOS is not going to magically make this all better. That means that we're probably not going to see an ARM Steam Deck anytime soon, because it would just be even less powerful than the current edition, so it would not make sense. ARM is really power efficient and it could be the future of handheld devices, but that future is not in sight right now. The technical part of the talk also talked about the architecture, and we know Valve is expanding Proton to support ARM processors, and they also mentioned Android APK support as an alternative compatibility path for VR games, which means Steam Frame will run Android VR titles. Another major theme of the presentation is that SteamOS is no longer just about the Steam Deck. Valve specifically talked about SteamOS compatible devices, mentioning things like the Lenovo Legion Go S and the Lenovo Legion Go 2. They also pointed out that the Linux desktop gaming audience is growing, which means more users are playing Steam games outside of Windows. So Valve is clearly preparing for a broader ecosystem of SteamOS hardware. They also gave developers a few recommendations for making games work better across this ecosystem. For example, developers should support different display aspect ratio, allow offline play even on first launch, and avoid saving graphics settings to the cloud because that can break things when switching between devices. Valve also emphasized better controller support, including multiple controllers even in single-player games, and proper integration with Steam input for things like controller glyphs and gyro controls. They're also expanding platform detection APIs so games can detect things like big picture mode, Proton, and different hardware platforms automatically. Valve also talked about continued improvements to Proton. They asked developers to avoid invasive DRM and anti-tamper system, which can cause compatibility issues. They also recommend modern video codecs like VP9 and AV1. For debugging Proton issues, developers can now use Visual Studio Remote Debugging, and Valve encouraged studios to report compatibility problems so they can fix them more quickly. And finally, there were updates on anti-cheat support, with built-in compatibility now available in several major anti-cheat solutions, although they admit that custom implementations can still be challenging. So, the biggest takeaway from this talk is that Valve is clearly building a long-term SteamOS ecosystem. You have handheld gaming with the Steam Deck, living room gaming to Steam Machine verified, VR hardware through the Steam Frame, and non-Valve hardware that can offer better performance at a different price point, whether it be handheld or a console. And all of these devices are tied together through SteamOS compatibility and Proton. What's especially interesting is that the Steam Deck testing pipeline has basically become the baseline compatibility test for this entire ecosystem. But I'm really curious what you think about one specific thing. Do you think 1080p at 30 FPS is an acceptable baseline for Steam Machine verification, or should Valve have targeted 60 FPS as a minimum for a living room device in 2026? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, consider leaving a like. If you want to stay up to date with everything Steam, Steam Deck, and Steam hardware related, consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.